Do you find yourself being forgetful of conversations that you've had in the past? Or perhaps you don't have anything meaningful to contribute to the conversation in the first place? This is At the Root of Knowledge, and in this episode, we're going to be talking about how to listen.
Hello and welcome to At the Root of Knowledge, where we discuss timeless topics. Through conversation, we try to identify underlying principles and assumptions beneath many of mankind's ideas and beliefs. All this in pursuit of the truth, and we share what we learn with you. Please keep in mind we are not experts, and just like you, we are here to learn. I'm Daniel Scheck, and with me is my co-host, Philip Rabarzik. How you doing, Phil?
I'm well. How about yourself?
Fantastic.
It's good to hear. So we're talking about listening. Is there a context on this, or a general how to listen? Or are we doing a listen on a one-on-one, or listen to, say, a speech in a public setting?
More conversational listening.
So like between you and I.
Right. It applies more broadly than that. More or less
But
how to listen.
Right.
How
But
to
I think the personal level is a good place to start. You know, I've definitely had some troubles with listening in the past, and especially if it's something that you don't want to listen to.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So I think there's a couple of good avenues we could go down here.
I do too. So, I think we should start off by talking about why we should worry about listening to people and listening to understand.
Listening to understand. I would say the first thing to consider would be that by listening to them, you can learn something that you don't know. You know, listen to someone as if they're telling you something that you don't know and that you want to know, which can be hard if you are bored by them.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say think about it as that conversation has the potential to give you a point of view that you haven't previously considered.
Well, that would take some level of humility. Or even, I think, maybe even just a grasp of reality to realize that that there are things that other people have to offer you.
Right. That your experience, it doesn't make up the entirety of the world.
Right.
Or everyone's experience.
Right. It's not as if you're infinitely better and you know. I guess you can't really be a narcissist and really try and listen like that, could you? Or could you?
Well,
To everyone, anyway.
I feel like it would be very difficult to. Although I suppose if you were able to somehow relate that back to yourself, like if you were saying that I'm listening to you because I
am a good listener or something.
I suppose you could say that. I was going to say that you're saying I want to know what this person is. Say they're a very successful entrepreneur, and maybe you're narcissistic and you want to be an entrepreneur, which you may run into some problems with, but nevertheless, you would then be listening to them because it would be, I want to use their tactics to benefit myself. Not that there's anything wrong with getting advice from people and using that to benefit yourself, but I was trying to use that as an example for how someone who is narcissistic might attempt to listen.
I understand that. I'm more thinking about, someone you think you don't have anything to learn from. Anything from. A bum on the side of the street. Maybe you think this person has nobody to offer me. Someone you would perceive as unsuccessful. You know what I mean?
Well, if you were to perceive that person as unsuccessful, I suppose then you might try to learn what not to do if that person is unsuccessful. Or you might take an analytical approach to it and say you're trying to find out what has caused them to be so unsuccessful in their endeavors.
I suppose that makes sense. I think you mentioned learning something. Listen to try and learn something. Is that a why you should do it or a how? So that you can learn new things?
I suppose it could be a little bit of both.
Okay.
I don't know if it's more of one than the other. Because, I've paraphrased that partially from a chapter in 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson, where he talks about listen to someone as if they know something that you don't. And so I would say that's a reason why. But the reason why you want to listen to them...
So that you can learn something?
the reason why you would want to would be because they know something that you don't.
Right.
And
it'd be advantageous to learn what
it
they
would
have
be
to teach you.
advantageous to learn it, yes.
Okay.
Or it could be. Because maybe they don't know that they actually know it. You know, have you ever had the type of conversation where you'll be talking with someone and they'll say something, maybe it's about their experience, it's an event that's happened to them, or maybe it happened to one of their friends, and they don't really make sense of it, and all of a sudden you can relate it to your life, you can relate it to something that's happening or that has happened, and it gives you a bit of clarity.
Yes, yeah. And another similar-ish type of thing, you ever had it when someone explained something to you and it made absolutely zero sense, like, why are they making this point? And then maybe it's years later, maybe it's that same day or the next day, you experience something, you see something, and you're like, whoa, it makes sense. It clicks, that piece of advice. Or maybe it's even a piece of advice that, you've been holding on for a long time that you never made any use of, and then you see it applied, and you're like, oh, hey,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it.
right. I've also seen it before where people understand things and it's really profound that they understand the things they understand. It's like, I think you just hit the nail right on the head.
Right.
With some
and,
things.
And sometimes, like as I said, sometimes people don't even know that they understand it.
Right.
Or maybe they, on some level they know, but it's not on a conscious level where they really understand it. It's just
intuitive.
Right, intuitive.
Well, that's your reason, one of your reasons for why. One of my reasons for why listening is important is because if you want to help anyone, you have to understand them. You have to understand them. And so you cannot just try and put medicine on a wound or give medicine for an illness, to use an analogy, if you haven't fully diagnosed what the illness actually is. So you have to be able to actually listen to understand. If you care about people, then you will listen to them and try and actually understand what they need and not just what you think they need or what you want to give them. Because it's easy to try and I feel like it's easy to just inflate your pride by applying a solution to somebody that worked for you, but unless you actually understand what they need, is not going to be helpful to them at all. If that makes sense.
I think another way of putting this, and I will use this a little later as to why I'm saying another way of putting it, is to think about how Stephen Covey talks about effectiveness versus efficiency. In that analogy, the efficient thing to do would be to get them diagnosed as quickly as possible and treat whatever your diagnosis is as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
But if that diagnosis is wrong, then it's ineffective.
Right.
So then, if you were to take more time to go ahead and correctly diagnose the problem, then you would only have to go ahead and fix that problem once, which would tend to be more effective and also more efficient if you only have to fix the problem once.
Oh, right. Right.
So then,
definitely more.
going off of what I said earlier about the why I was saying another way of putting it is that one thing that I've found that's successful, at least for me, as to a way of how to listen better, is to take what someone has just said to me. In that instance, you had just talked about doing things right the first time, and I took that idea and relayed it back to you in a different scenario, in slightly different form, to see if I was comprehending what you were saying correctly. If we were both communicating with each other in a way that we understand each other.
Right. We give it back to him to see if you comprehend the ideas, the concepts behind.
Right. Similar to how you would take an idea from a textbook that you might be reading for a class, and to go ahead and take an idea that you've learned in that textbook and apply it somewhere else and see if it'll work.
Right. Like how some teachers, when they give you short answer questions, they tell you not to write it word for word out of the book.
Right.
Not to
Or
just
they'll
copy.
say, what's an example from your life?
Right.
To make sure you're actually comprehending what they're talking about.
Right. That requires a little bit of thinking, doesn't it? Not just regurgitating things, actually.
Yes. And I think one thing that, in fact, no, I know one thing that becomes very scarce in conversation is to take a break. And I don't mean take a break from a conversation in the sense of a long break. I mean to take a few seconds to formulate a well thought out response. Usually you'll hear people put in words that don't really add anything to the conversation. Words that are like, so, and I do this far more often than I'd like to admit.
Yeah, or
That's another one there.
I use that one a lot,
And most of the time it's second nature. You don't even notice that you're actually doing that until it's brought up, and then you're super conscious of it for a little while. At least that's been my experience. But we were just talking about that in one of my classes, in my effective public speaking class. We were just talking about how people will not pause in a conversation to think out. But I think the right thing to do is to pause and to think about what you want to say.
I have a question.
Okay.
Do you have Coulter Boyle?
Sorry?
Coulter Boyle, is he your instructor for public speaking? Are you at the Mason campus or the Dayton one?
I believe this particular instruction works at the Dayton one.
Oh.
Although everything I'm in currently is online.
Okay, because Coulter Boyle, He was my public speaking instructor. I was just curious. I didn't know you were taking public speaking this semester.
Yes.
I took effective public speaking at Sinclair.
And I know we're getting a little bit off track, but I suppose speaking is a part of a conversation, and so is listening. So we might be able to tie it back in. What was your experience with the class as a whole?
It was a it was a fun class. It was a challenging class. I feel like even before these podcasts and before speech, like this pressure to say something meaningful and
To contribute to the conversation?
sure.
I might be a little off on that.
But that was really difficult for me because I always felt like no matter how good the speech was or how good people told me the speech was, I always felt like it was short of what I wanted to accomplish. Like when I give a speech, you've heard those great speeches before, where you're moved.
Sure, yeah.
You're shaken, to the core. That's always like what I'm going for, and I always felt like I fell short. So it was actually a little bit discouraging. I did one speech where I felt like I was actually two speeches. Did two speeches where I felt like I actually fairly well accomplished what I was going for, but it was not an easy class. And that wasn't because there was a ton of material. It's just I feel like to do it justice, you kind of have to really get into it. You can't halfway do it, and do it well. But I enjoyed it thoroughly, even though it was difficult and challenging. I think it did help me speak publicly. Definitely feel more confident in group settings. Not that I was particularly unconfident before. I wasn't, the most confident, but it wasn't like I was a complete introvert beforehand. But I enjoyed it. I liked the class a lot. I couldn't understand. I couldn't understand what they would be like trying to do that class online. For me,
thus far, it's mainly just been going through material, which, for the most part, I'll say was just the instructor going through a PowerPoint presentation and explaining it that way.
What's the book you guys are using?
I believe it's a Sinclair Communications.
Is it spiral bound paperback?
Yes.
Might have been the same book we used. Were there a bunch of pictures of people talking to each other on the front cover?
No.
Okay, maybe it's not the same book. I can't remember what it's called. I have it back at home.
Anyway, my teacher is his last name escapes me, but his first name is Rick, and it's kind of interesting because he was a radio show host for 20 or so years, I think.
Oh, really?
And he has a very good voice for radio show hosting. You can tell it's the kind of voice that you would hear on the radio.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going a little off track here, but that kind of got me thinking about how I don't really think that my voice is very suited for radio.
Is this something we should put up to a vote? For all those people listening, should
I be replaced?
No, that's not what I was going to say.
Hope not.
On a scale from 1 to 10, how good is Phil's radio voice? Drop your comments down below.
Yeah, or send us an email. Anyway,
if your radio station, administrator, just know Phil's in the market, so you can just go ahead and send us send us, an application form.
So anyway, back to our
Maybe not.
original topic here. Getting a bit off track. What are some ways that you have found that have helped you better listen to and comprehend a conversation?
Okay. So first of all, listening's hard.
Yes. I think we're both in agreement there.
I think listening is harder than talking, but I also think the more you listen, the easier it gets. Much, much easier. And I think there's a few things that I do and have done that I believe have helped me listen much more. And a lot of it's just reminding yourself of certain things. One of the things I do is ask myself if I care about the person. Because I find myself not wanting to listen to people a lot. And not so much now as I used to, even so much. And it's something I want to keep working on. But when I get like I'm bored of a conversation or I don't care what this person has to say, I just ask myself, well, do I actually care about this person? And that helps remind me that they're important too. And I think, okay, I would want them to listen to me. I hate it when people don't listen to me. Especially if it's something I really care about, and I'm trying.
Most of the time, if I find someone isn't listening to me, I'll just
stop talking.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Because at that point, it's I already know what I'm going to say, and if you're not interested in what I have to say, then
it depends on who I'm talking to and what I'm talking about. If I really want to share something with somebody, I anyway, and that helps me listen. Is try and think like, okay, how would I feel if I was the one talking right now? And then the other thing I gotta bear in mind is I don't understand. It's like something you gotta like constantly remind yourself of is your actual lack of understanding. Like you said, go in to learn. Constantly remind yourself and kind of give yourself a dose of I'm an idiot.
Humility?
Well, I don't want to say I'm humble, but you got to remind yourself you're an idiot. Roughly, sometimes you just got to,
or at the very least that you're ignorant.
Yes, okay, that's a better word. You got to remind yourself that you're ignorant. I feel like a lot. I do. I have to remind myself of that, I feel like. And that you don't understand. You do not understand what's in someone else's head. You might understand some of the ideas, but you don't fully I think it's silly to try and pretend like you understand people. Cuz I've done that. I've been in that boat where it's like, okay, I understand what this person needs, how they feel. I think it's better to assume you don't know and remind yourself that you don't know. You don't know what they need. You don't know how they feel. And you're there to try and understand what they're saying, how they feel, And even in pursuit of understanding that, you never fully come to terms with how they understand. I mean, let's be real. Do you really fully understand yourself? I don't. I don't fully understand me. I don't understand all my inclinations. There's a lot about myself I don't fully understand. So how could I expect to really understand anyone else?
Right. Well, that's another thing that's a reason why you should listen, is because sometimes you know something, but you don't know how to articulate it, and someone else will articulate it, and then they've given you the ability to now know how to do that.
Right. Oh, definitely. Definitely.
Especially when you're getting into some complex ideas and you're not really sure how to put it out there.
What about you? What are some techniques you've used to listen?
So I already said the one about relaying the information back.
Right.
Let's see, other techniques. I may have already touched on this as well, trying to apply it to my life, see if it does apply or doesn't apply. One other thing is to ask questions about it. If I really don't understand it, or if I try to apply it to my life and it doesn't apply, and I've seen the opposite, which that does happen sometimes, then I will make that known. Make it known that I have had the opposite experience, and then try to engage in a conversation with them in which you would attempt to figure out what led to both of those experiences being so polar opposite of each other. And I think that's a big one for me. I have a few big ones, I guess, but ask to inquire and ask questions about the topic, because it keeps your mind focused on what they are saying. If you cannot relay that information back, then you know that you don't understand.
Right. And
One thing in particular, sorry to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
One thing in particular that I find difficult is to try and listen to something that you don't find interesting. Or that I don't find interesting, I should say.
Yes. Yes, I agree. I agree. That can be very difficult. Somebody's talking your ear off, and it's particularly difficult from my experience when you got something else on your mind, something else you're worrying about. That's one thing I'm terrible at. I'm absolutely horrible about. If I gotta go, if I'm thinking about something else, if I got something important or pressing, whether it's emails I gotta send to people, or whether it's a project I'm working on, or whether it's the rest of my day and the stuff I need to get done, and someone tries to talk to me without my invitation for them to do so, it is so difficult for me to actually care about anything they say, because I'm just thinking about leaving.
Especially if, for instance, you're tired and you just want to go to sleep.
Oh yeah, definitely that too.
And even if the conversation would be meaningful otherwise, sometimes things like being tired or being hungry, that's another thing that if I'm hungry, I'm just not able to listen.
I'm there with you. I can't. I'm horrible when I'm hungry. I'm horrible.
Yeah, and
I get anxious and all over the place too.
Right, and that's something that just has to do with the dynamics of communication.
Mm-hmm.
So I suppose there is a good time to listen, and inopportune times to listen.
Right. Well, I don't think it's really okay to be rude. If you really can't listen or you got something else you need to be doing, I think one thing I could really use to work at is to politely say, because when I feel like that, when I feel like I'm rushing to get somewhere and I already tell them I got plans and they keep talking anyways, I usually respond one of two ways. I sit there semi-impatiently, wanting to leave and just be silent until they stop talking, or I say, okay, bye, and I just walk up and leave the conversation. I'm really bad at politely walking away from conversations when I got other stuff going on.
Now, this is my opinion, is that if you're in that type of situation and you were to first politely say that I am, for instance, I am sorry that I'm not able to engage in this conversation with you. This is a very formal way of saying it, I suppose. I'm sorry that I'm not able to engage in this conversation with you, but I am preoccupied with being late for work, with having a a commitment to something else.
Mm-hmm.
So unfortunately, I will have to bid you good day. And then I
formal,
think
right?
that's the point where you walk away. If they keep talking at that point, I would tend to think that they are. It more shows that they aren't respecting your wishes at the time,
Right.
your time for that matter.
Right. It's a balancing thing. It's just a matter of not being rude. Right? Your time, your ears, your attention is your resource to control. Not someone else's, but charity. We must be charitable and not rude and try and be polite. But right at the end of the day, you make decisions with your own resources, and you spend them as is best fit, or you think is best fit, at least. Right.
So what are some processes for implementation?
Of listening?
Yes, how would you go about training yourself? Because it doesn't just happen. You don't just become a good listener.
Okay. Yes. Okay, that's
So-
great. That's a great question.
Right.
So there's a few things you can do. There's some good books out there that talk about listening. There are plenty of good books out there. Even YouTube videos, I've watched some good TED Talks. A TED Talk only goes so far, It only works if you apply what, or even a book or whatever. That might not be a bad place to start, but I say, trying to make it a habit. Trying to make it a habit to listen, particularly when you are not. Well, try and make it a habit to listen to everybody. But maybe even find someone who's not necessarily talkative and encourage them to talk and try and practice. I guess practice trying to listen to people as much as you can. Practice not talking. Try and practice talking less and listening more intentionally. That's the big thing is, and then, there's some people, I'll be honest, where it's like, I don't want to listen to what this person has to say. Make a point to listen to those people, that you wouldn't normally listen to. You'd normally just tune out, or ignore. I would make a special point to listen to those people, and actually try and understand what they're saying, even if it's small. You got to start somewhere. And then another thing is, every time you don't want to listen, make a point to listen. Sometimes I know most of the time when I'm doing something, just speaking from past experiences, where I subconsciously knew it wasn't right. Subconsciously knew it needed an improvement. I shouldn't be doing it. Whatever. It almost, like, I cringed a little bit when someone would poke at it, or even poke around it. And it's like, I don't want to hear this. That when you really don't want to listen, I feel like it's most important to make a special point of listening.
Right,
more
because
intently.
most likely that's something that you need to hear.
Mm-hmm.
At least in theory, I suppose.
A lot of times, I think it is.
Especially, I cannot remember the philosopher who talked about the ethical approach to an argument or debate is to know the opposition's argument better than your own argument.
That's what Dale Carnegie, he talked about that.
He does?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, what about you? What are your implementation ideas?
Well, I would say if you're having trouble listening to someone, try and ask yourself why first. I know that sounds very basic, but I guess sometimes that's what helps me the most, is starting with the most basic fundamental thing I can think of, is to really say, okay, why do I not want to hear this? Why is it that I don't want to listen?
Mm-hmm.
And now if it's something that, like, you're hungry or a similar scenario, then maybe you need to address that before you'll be able to listen effectively. But if it's something like that they have an opposing viewpoint and you do not want to hear about it, you are set in stone about your position on the matter, then I would go back to that, and the example of what Dale Carnegie said about knowing their argument better than you know your own, because by knowing their argument you see the flaws in your own argument, and that's not the natural thing to do.
And
naturally,
the
humans are inclined to want to read or listen to things that agree with them,
right.
and to tend to poke holes in the arguments that they disagree with.
Right. And
so that would be one major thing I would say to address first. And then what you were saying about practice, that also goes a long way to practice. And I would say maybe even practice by yourself.
yeah, I talk to myself all the time, and I don't know how healthy it is, but like I have like, 5-hour conversations with myself. I'll just
I do not know that there's any empirical evidence to back it up, but I do the same thing, and I find it somewhat therapeutic, I'll say, to in that it helps me to sort out what I'm thinking, to hear it out loud and to be able to say, maybe that's not right. Have you ever had been in a type of conversation where you'll say something and you say, now that I hear it out loud, that's not right.
Mm-hmm.
Or that's not.
Yep. And now that it's coming out of my mouth, it's like, yeah, I didn't think that all the way through.
Right.
In my head.
That's kind of the same thing that I would say applies to talking
with yourself.
Is that you have to hear it out loud. And it's a similar thing to writing down your ideas, which I also have been trying to do as well, just to clear out some of the clutter, if you will, some of the gray areas where I'm not sure how I feel about it, or I don't want to talk about it. Because one thing that I would say is that not wanting to do something is not always. This is not always true, but sometimes not being inclined to do something could mean that it's something that you should be doing. And I'm kind of repeating myself there, but it's really been true for me for many things, is that, for instance,
what you're naturally inclined to do isn't necessarily what you should be doing.
Right. Exactly. That you should question it. I think you should question everything. And
question the things you agree with twice.
Yes, that's correct. Because let's face it, you're more inclined to agree with the things that you
already agree with.
Or no, I'm sorry, to accept the things that you already agree with.
Right. I always try to make a point. Were you done with that thought?
I think so.
I always try and make a point to listen to the other side, whether or not I give it full merit. maybe I don't, but I try to listen to the other side. I always try and understand where they're coming from. I mean, even with certain figures of immense power, we'll say, in today's world, there's some people I just completely disagree with. Completely disagree with some very powerful authority figures, and I'll go and I'll watch interviews with them. I'll listen to interviews they have with people. I'll listen to the speeches. I'll listen to what they have to say. I'll try and find. I'll even try and find stuff that they say that I do agree with.
Right, and I think that's a good thing to try and practice, is to
like, you take up an issue with something like, not to get politically into stuff, but let's say you wanted to talk about gun control.
Okay.
I would go and I would look at people saying why we should have gun control, and I would go watch interviews and newscasts on that. Even though, I know my opinion, I know what I believe is completely correct with a pretty high level of confidence, but I'm still going to go and listen to what the other people are saying.
Right.
Which is what you were saying. Understand the other person's argument better than your own.
Right. And if you do that successfully, then you should be able to. Now, of course, if you're extremely biased, then you're still dealing with another issue, I suppose.
Right. I'm sure my bias comes in the way of me giving full merit
I
to
think most people have a bias that tends to get in the way.
Mm-hmm.
And I've let that do that many times, quite recently, in fact. And I had to go and talk to someone who will remain anonymous, that to help me sort out why I was so disinclined to listening to about it.
Mm-hmm.
And they really helped me see that just because I'm listening to it, it doesn't mean I'm agreeing with it, first of all. And then secondly, by listening to it, you then understand what their point of view is, where they are coming from.
Right.
So, do you think there is any way to deal with someone not to flip it around? Is there a way to deal with someone not listening to you?
Sure. There's a few ways. It really depends on the angle and the perspective, the motive behind trying to get them to listen to you. If you just want to feel important, if you just want to feel important, like someone's listening to you because you have something important to say, you can always try and tailor the conversation to make it entertaining for them and more enjoyable for them to hear what you have to say. That's one technique. If that's your motivation, not that that's a great motivation to go into a conversation with, to just feel important, but if that is your motivation, you could do that. Try and tailor it to the other person. If your motivation is to actually help someone, you've looked through it and you have this meaningful advice, which you believe is the other person really should hear. Again, tailor it in a way that attracts their interest if you can. Make it relevant to them. Show them why they should listen, why they should care about what you have to say. Another way to make them listen is for you to listen to them first. I think that's a very effective way is listening first, and asking them questions first, and really trying to understand their side first, because that will make them more inclined to listen to you. I think if you're just talking and they're not gonna say anything and they're not interested in talking, and you're not sure if they're listening or not, you can, and I've seen a lot of people use this. I've used this plenty in my own life. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying? You get where I'm going with this?
Yes,
you know what I mean?
ask for feedback.
Yeah, that's
Sure.
another way.
Sure, yeah, that's something that I've tried a few times, I suppose,
Mm-hmm.
is to use that as a way of confirming that they're understanding it, and well, I guess two, that they're understanding it, but one, that they're listening.
Right. With little kids, I don't know if you've ever tried to teach little kids. They take a lot of patience.
They do tend to take an extreme amount of patience.
And I'm sure I took more patience than most other little kids. I remember somewhat being a little kid and how much of a total brat I was. Not that I'm any better now, just different. But yes, you just got to be very, very patient with them, and you cannot get mad because many of them, they just do not have the attention. They just don't have the attention, you know?
I think patience is a key for any. I mean, it's particularly with small children. Yes, it's very, very important to be patient. But I think patience is also vital for dealing with someone who isn't listening.
Mm-hmm.
That if they're not listening, maybe it's because they haven't heard something that has resonated with them yet.
Right. Try and tailor it to something that's and then another thing you can do, sometimes people just are convinced they're not going to listen to you. What you can try and do is ask questions and make them think and come up with answers and see if you can lead them to the point you're trying to make without even telling that to them. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Make them find the point you're trying to get across on their own. You know,
Without having to spell it out for them.
right? And then it also be. Go ahead.
To be able to have them feel like they have accomplished something by answering these questions. They are gaining something from it.
Right.
But they're figuring out by themselves. You're not just saying this is how it is.
Right. And if they think it's their idea, they're going to be way more inclined to believe it.
Yes.
So that's another method. And, that takes some tact and skill to take that approach. And it really depends on how far, you know what I mean? It depends on how much of a leap you want to make to get someone to accept that. Sometimes you can kind of paint around a picture. You can paint around a picture and make the setup, and then ask them the question and make them come up with the answer on their own. I feel like if you want to inspire someone, like a friend or something, you paint an image of them. One way to, let's say you want to inspire your friend to do something better. You want to motivate them to change in some way or apply themselves more. You kind of paint this picture around them, but then give them the opportunity to imagine themselves as the hero in the center of the picture, if that makes sense. I know that's really vague.
So, kind of metaphorically speaking, then you're laying out the framework for this story
Mm-hmm.
that they are the protagonist in,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not necessarily centered on them at first. It's laying that frame that you're talking about,
Right.
and then slowly
And bringing in the components that you're wanting them to see for themselves, the different virtues, the different habits, whatever it is you're trying to bring together in it. The ideas of friendship. I'm not sure if this is making sense. How I'm trying to convey this to you, but
I think so. Almost like a puzzle, to
Mhm.
where if you've ever started to put a puzzle together by building the outside frame,
Mm-hmm.
find all the outside pieces, and then you put them all together, and then you have your outside frame, and it makes it easier to put this stuff inside the frame.
Right.
And maybe you even have to help put a few pieces here and there in, and then eventually they start to see the picture that you're trying to make, and they start to fill in that picture
Right.
by
Because
themselves, and by doing that, they feel that they've contributed adequately.
right, and I think for at least myself, that's the only way to inspire me through words alone, or not the only way, but the best way. I hate it when people say, come up to me, compliment me, say how great I am and how I can be anything, and they just lay it all out for me. And then I almost get this tension. No, I do get this tension inside myself, and there's like this grinding within myself when someone gives me a compliment. You know, especially when it's a really, really high compliment. And I don't feel like I fully deserved it. I feel it the same way, especially when I was going through high school. People tell me, "Oh, you got all this potential." Not just me. I mean, people tend to do this a lot to kids. There's nothing wrong with a compliment here and there, like you have, talking about someone's potential. But it's much more inspiring for me if I feel like I am developing. Like I got to be the creative artist, the developer of myself,
Yeah. Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying there. That it's more interesting and more fulfilling if you are able to, I don't want to say articulate, but maybe that is a word you could use, to articulate the idea. For instance, being that, try to think how to apply this to the getting compliments, because it's almost something, at least that I think of, is it's almost like a reciprocity thing, where you receive a compliment and then you feel like maybe I should compliment them. But at the same time, what I often find is I don't know what I like. If someone was to compliment me on how I was to be dressed very nicely, my initial reaction there is to compliment them on how they're dressed. But that sounds like you're just reiterating what they've said.
Right.
So
it's kind of like when somebody buys you a Christmas gift. You'd feel bad if you didn't buy them a Christmas gift too.
Right. Which you kind of...
Some people would.
I guess so, yeah.
Some people would. I might not. No, I probably usually would feel bad if somebody got me a gift and I didn't get them a gift.
I think I would too. Although it would depend on the person, I guess.
That's a little bit awkward too, giving someone a gift and they being all like, "Oh, I didn't get you anything."
Thank you, I didn't get you anything. Yeah.
It's like, that's okay. I wasn't expecting anything.
Right.
That's one thing I think I won't go down that road. That's not what we're talking about right now.
Fair enough. So do you think we've hit the nail pretty much on the head with listening, or do you think there's some areas that we should still go into a bit more here?
I think we can. One thing I would have liked to address earlier is what listening actually is, and we've talked about this and kind of skirted around it. What actually is listening?
Listening? Well, it's
the essence of listening.
Definitely something that you have to actively do it. The essence of listening, I would say, would be to take in what is being put forth. I'll say what is being said. And to attempt to comprehend that in the best way, to the best of your ability.
Okay. I would say listening is, I think, probably in its most perfect form. Listening is trying to become another person, trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes, and absorb things the same way they do.
Hmm.
A more artistic way of saying to actually try and understand someone
Yes.
at in its most perfect form. And that's different from just hearing what someone says and applying it from your perspective, which is what is more naturally done by most people, I think, including myself. You take the information they give you, and then you look at it through the lens of your perspective and see how it applies, which can be useful. But I think listening in its truest form, in my opinion, is adopting the other person's perspective. Leaving your shoes and going and standing in theirs. That's really listening. That's listening to understand, I believe. Not that you can't do both, not that you shouldn't do both, not that both aren't useful, but I think really listening to someone, that's what you do. Like if even like a parent talking to their teenager. I don't have any kids, right? I don't have any teenage kids, but I would hope that as a parent, when my kid, teenager, or any kid, not just I'm just thinking of teenagers because of all the stereotypes, but comes and talks to me, I'm able to try and see things from their angle, from their perspective, and be able to at least momentarily put aside my notions, my experiences, my beliefs, my ideas, and comprehend what they have to offer first from their perspective before. And then that's the listening aspect. And then the actual diagnostic assistance aspect, which I think should come after listening, then that'll come into play. And then I can apply my own experiences and stuff from it. But I think first, it's best to try and adopt them, their, as much as you can,
Hmm.
their perspective, their
To really leave yourself behind, and leave yourself with your experiences and everything that you bring with you, to leave that behind and to attempt as best you can to see the world through their perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
And I would say that's the actual listening. Putting your perspective and stuff into it is part of formulating a response, but I don't think that's actually listening.
I think it's an element of listening.
I think it's a separate component.
I don't know that you can break listening down into one specific
I'm just saying
element. I think it's a process and that's one of the
you could be
processes that you can employ in attempting to listen.
right. I'm just saying, from my perspective and understanding, that is the essence. That is the spirit of listening. Most fundamentally. But my opinion could be wrong.
No, I think you put that very well. I think that's I know that I have a lot to work on as far as listening goes. And I'm sure there are some things that I'm leaving out that would be helpful.
Yeah, there's a lot to cover, it's not it wouldn't be a timeless principle worth talking about if we could really cover all of it in, an hour to an hour and a half like we do on most of our episodes. We shouldn't be talking about him if you can confine everything there that's fascinating about him into
Right.
that short of a
Right.
period.
And something that many of our listeners may not really see is that just because we've talked about a topic on and made an episode on it doesn't mean we're
Done talking about it.
Yes,
Yeah.
most of the time we do spend more time talking about it. Not necessarily right after we're done recording, but most of the time we'll revisit a topic.
Right. And
sooner or later, I suppose.
yeah, I'm sure many of the topics we've already talked about, we may even just redo the entire episode because, hey, we missed a bunch of stuff.
And that's part of.
There's more material here to cover.
Yes, that's part of. I think that's part of the game is taking what you know and laying it out, and then finding out new things that you didn't know. At least that's how I see it. But I think we did a pretty good job, at least from my understanding, of giving some good reasons as to why to listen and how you can listen, really. And some practices for going about that, for making it into a habit.
I don't want to make this too much longer, but there's one thing I failed to mention.
Okay.
You asked me about application.
Yes.
Of listening techniques. One thing I found that is very, very, very helpful is to try and write out what you think the other person believes. To try and write out how you understand, especially if it's someone where the relationship's very important. I've done this with my dad, with various other people. Try and actually write out what you think about the person, and that's something I found really helpful. Just wanted to add that in.
Okay. But we did talk about also dealing with someone who won't listen, or at least some ways of dealing with someone who won't listen. And I think we both gave pretty adequate responses for how we view the essence of listening, as you put it.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think we did a good job covering what we did cover, and I'm sure this topic will be revisited in the future. Thank you all for tuning in. Maybe we got something wrong. Let us know. What do you think about this topic? And any other topics? Is there anything else you're interested in us talking about? You can find us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Podbeam, at the Root of Knowledge. You can also
we are
us
also
emails.
Available on Google Podcasts.
Oh, we're back on Google
Yes.
Podcast. Okay, Google Podcasts and Spotify.
Yes.
Did I say Podbeam?
Yes, you did.
So feel free to check us out on any of those websites. We also have a Gmail account at therootofknowledge@gmail.com. And yeah.
And as another note, look for our Patreon account. Should be coming up pretty soon, within the next week or two, hopefully.
Mm-hmm.
And we will. We might even have some surprises on there for you.
Yeah. Well,
So
we'll wait off on that.
So keep an eye out for it.
Yeah. Stay tuned in. All right. You guys have a great one. Bye.